Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the Geneva Center for Security Policy and to this fourth edition of the Geneva Security Debates. I also extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests and speakers who have agreed to participate in our discussion. Thank you for sharing your immense insights on today's debate topic. Protecting civilians is a moral and a legal duty. The fourth Geneva Convention and the Convention's additional protocols provide legal protection for victims of war. They constitute a well-established cornerstone of international law. In addition, organizations including the UN, but also NATO and countries such as the United Kingdom and Switzerland have all adopted or revised policies on protection of civilians. Yet, despite this normative progress, the continued brutality of war confirms that we still have a long way to go. According to estimates by the United Nations, at least 5,916 civilians, including 379 children, have been killed in Ukraine since Russia's invasion began. Nearly 15 million people, a third of the Ukrainian population, have been forced to leave their homes. The suffering experienced by civilians in Ukraine is shocking. But we must not forget that similar human tragedy is unfolding in conflicts all over the world. In Yemen and Somalia, where millions of people are already displaced due to years of conflict, the UN is warning that a devastating famine is imminent. In Syria, a deadly cholera outbreak is emerging as the 11-year war has forced people to rely on unsafe water sources. These realities are painful reminders that despite our efforts, despite over 70 years of treaties and policies to protect civilians in conflict, their suffering appears no less severe in this century than in the last. Why? One partial reason may be that the nature of the problem has evolved. Conflicts themselves have changed significantly since the experience of the Second World War, which led to the creation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Today, the security landscape presents new threats to civilians and greater complexity for those who would protect them. Most conflicts in the 21st century are civil wars, where multiple armed groups live and fight among local communities. Conflicts have become longer, weakening national governments and leaving civilians more vulnerable not only to bombs and bullets, but to drought, disease, and disaster. Fighting in urban areas appears more and more common, resulting in enormous human suffering in cities from Mosul to Mariupol. And even in the absence of armed conflict, civilians are increasingly targeted with disinformation and cyber attacks that disrupt the patterns of daily life. Despite these new challenges, the focus of our discourse seems to be reverting back to the security of the state, its sovereignty, deterrence, and defense. These traditional concepts are relevant and important, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. But they give us little guidance on how to better safeguard the individual human being affected by modern conflict. To ensure that threats to civilians remain a priority, we must integrate a human-centric approach to security. Against the backdrop of a new security landscape, we should rethink whether our current framework for protection of civilians remains fit for purpose. Are existing policies on prevention of civilian harm making a difference? Are the current legal obligations placed upon states under international law sufficient? And how can calls for protection of at-risk groups, including children, women, and persons with disabilities, be put into action? Tobias Wessner and Stuart Casey Maslin explore these questions in great depth in the book International Law and Policy on the Protection of Civilians. Their analysis represents the first comprehensive treatment of this subject and comes at a time when such input is urgently needed. Switzerland has announced that protecting civilians will be one of its 4 core priorities in the UN Security Council. The United States recently introduced a new action plan for addressing civilian harm. Yet, civilian suffering continues, so the time for reinvigorating the protection of civilians is now. How exactly we may want to do so is what we will discuss here today. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of our debate, Mr. Tobias Wessner, GCSP's Head of Research and Policy Advice Department and Cluster Head of the Security and Law Program. On our panel, we are honored to be joined by Ms. Irene Felin, NATO's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security since 2021 and founder of Women in International Security Italy. We also welcome Mr. Ralph Mamia. Mr. Mamia is an advisor at the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance at the US Department of Defense, where he contributed significantly to the department's handbook on mitigating civilian harm. He has worked for many years with protection of civilians at the UN, including as team leader. Also with us is Dr. Stuart Casey Maslin, international lawyer and extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria, with extensive expertise on the use of force and protection of civilians. Last but not least, we welcome Mr. Christian Cardon de Lichbouer, Chief Protection Officer at the ICRC, who has published and worked for the protection of civilians with the ICRC since 2005. Before handing over to Mr. Wessner and this extraordinary panel, I would want to first give the floor to Ms. Oksana Kikot, Deputy Country Director for Ukraine at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. We are honored that Ms. Kikot has traveled all the way from Ukraine to talk about protection of civilians in the country where she has worked for 15 years. I'm sure that her reporting from the war will provide valuable input and a strong foundation for our discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists. It is a pleasure and honor for me to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to discuss how we can improve protection of civilians based on our recent experiences in Ukraine. Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, which I represent today, has been working in Ukraine since 2017 to improve the mechanisms and frameworks for protection of civilians. We were among those who advocated and provided expertise to develop the National Strategy on Protection of Civilians. We also contributed to the establishment of the analytical unit at the Armed Forces of Ukraine to track and mitigate civilian harm. We also were one of the very few NGOs in Ukraine who engaged with security and defense actors on protection of civilians. On February 24, 2022, everything changed. The context for protection of civilians, the protection needs, protection actors, and protection priorities. As Ambassador already mentioned in his opening remarks, the death toll among civilian population in Ukraine of the escalation of the conflict has been devastating. Thousands of people killed, thousands of people injured, and this is continuing to happen. The Russian armed forces has purposely employed strategies on the battlefield and beyond to increase civilian harm. Their tactics of using indiscriminate weapons in urban areas, attacking civilian infrastructure, denial of safe passage of civilians from conflict zone has all contributed to the fact that many, many people have died. And the recent example of such strategies you might have seen yesterday when the Russian missiles fall on the downtown Kyiv, killing civilians who were just walking on the street to their workplaces because it was 9 a.m. The majority of the civilian harm recorded so far resulted from the use of the explosive weapons with wide area effects, including shelling from heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, and missiles and airstrikes. The war in Ukraine has created a huge humanitarian crisis in many parts of the countries, millions of people needing humanitarian assistance, and we expect those numbers to increase due to impending winter, which will highlight vulnerabilities of conflict-affected communities and areas. Despite this devastating horror, civilians in Ukraine have and continue to refuse to be just victims and demonstrate incredible resilience. Ukrainian civilians and civil society have truly become the first respondents, relying on each other and finding creative ways how to survive the hostilities and help each other. We have seen civilians self-organized in the basements and developing mechanisms how they can stay in touch with their family and friends and help those in need. For example, they were setting up power stations underground to charge their electronic devices. They were also installing internet hotspots in the basements to have access to news and information, which was critical to their survival. In addition, people created chats in apartment buildings to share information about the extra supplies they could give away to their neighbors who were in need, to share information about the nearest shelter and how to get there, and information about evacuation routes. Some people who evacuated left keys from their homes and from their cars and put their supplies in the communal spaces so that civilians who stayed behind could use those to stay alive. In many cases, our local civil society were the only ones who could access civilians who needed protection, especially those from vulnerable groups, such as people with low mobility, with disabilities, and elderly. This was made possible due to already existing connections of civil society to communities and civilians, to the ongoing on-the-ground presence, which allowed them to know what are the priority needs of those communities, have access to those communities, and including those communities which were under direct attack. For example, since February, local NGOs Proliska and Vostok SOS evacuated thousands of people from communities under direct attack to safer places. In addition, on February 25th, just one day after the full-scale invasion, the over 20 Ukrainian civil society organizations created a coalition, just called 5 a.m., to document war crimes, to collect data on civilian harm and harm to civilian infrastructure. Despite the impressive self-organization efforts and creative strategies civilians adopted to avoid harm and help those in need, civilians remain at huge risk and continue facing large protection gaps. The unpredictable nature of hostilities and Russian tactics to harm civilians further undermine our protection strategies. The lack of predictable pauses in hostilities puts civilians in conflict-affected communities into additional danger. Based on the interviews Civic conducted in the conflict-affected communities, newly liberated communities, and communities which are located along the front line, which makes them potentially vulnerable to further hostilities, we can see that those communities and those civilians are still not fully prepared to possible further and future hostilities. In many communities, there are still not enough shelters, and those which do exist are not adequately equipped, especially for those civilians from vulnerable groups with low mobility and disabilities. Elderly people who often don't have smartphones and access to internet, thus they're lacking timely information about nearby shelters, how to evacuate, whom to ask for help, when to evacuate. In addition, civilians in newly liberated areas lack access to basic needs due to destroyed infrastructure, and they also face a huge threat of weapon contamination, in particular UXOs. In addition, civic protection needs assessment identified a protection gap between communities, local authorities, which have primary responsibility for protection of civilians, other protection actors such as the military and international organizations. There is a need to build local protection actors' capacity to identify protection needs and concerns of civilians and jointly find solutions how to address those needs through effective civil-military coordination mechanisms. The Ukrainian government working hard to address those gaps, yet civilians we talked to wished for better advanced contingency planning, including evacuation planning. They also wished for training on how to survive the war. For example, they're asking about first aid training or training what to do if you're caught outside in the bombardment, what happened to people in Kiev yesterday, and what to do in case of the nuclear threat materializes. The war in Ukraine is continuing with devastating consequences for civilians. We know that it is not a short-term situation, unfortunately. We worked in Ukraine since 2017, and we know that even a de-escalation of violence doesn't mean that threats to communities disappear. We at Civic believe that some valuable lessons can be drawn from Ukraine's experience dealing with massive protection needs over the past 7 months. And the situation in Ukraine has shown a crisis could deteriorate very quickly, and there is a need to be prepared to deal with huge protection and humanitarian needs at the community level where those needs are emerging. And the lack of predictable pauses in hostilities makes it very difficult for civilians to provide for each other. Thus, international and national bodies must work better to support protection practices by focusing on preparedness and improving the capacity of local protection actors to address civilians' protection needs and concerns. We have the norms, but now is the time for implementation and for allocating resources to provide a response, a kind of response our local civil society did, quick, decisive, and focused on protection needs of communities. International aid agencies must work to channel funds to support local response efforts and build capacity of local protection actors and make them more sustainable. This might include, for example, investing in Ukrainian institutions and reinforcing local and national response mechanisms, continue providing capacity building to security and defense actors to protect civilians, develop mechanisms to address urgent protection needs through local civil society and make sure they have resources and ability to address communities' protection needs in a timely manner, and developing and establishing coordination mechanisms at different levels so that civil society, communities, local authorities, defense actors could come together and work together to find solutions to protection challenges and needs. We also focus on building capacity of civilians to self-protect and providing them means to do so, such as protective supplies, for example, vests and medical kits. And most importantly, exert pressure on international community to hold perpetrator to account for the indiscriminate harm to civilians. Currently at Civic, we are implementing technical solutions on the ground to connect civilians to key stakeholders so that everyone could access bomb shelters, have access to an information that informs their decisions on their security and safety. For example, we're working in communities to build capacity of civilians and protection actors on such topics as mine awareness, what to do in case of shelling, what to do if the nuclear weapons is used. And those topics were identified as priorities and topics of interest by communities themselves. We also continue to play a critical role in liaising with the military, developing and supporting civil-military coordination mechanisms at community levels and international level. We now just recently conducted a survey on self-protection practices adopted by civilians to avoid harm. And we believe that this research might be helpful for other countries who could be at potential risk and preparing for similar situation. Nowadays, Civic is one of the two, I think, NGOs in Ukraine who provide capacity building to the military, in particular, newly created territorial defense forces on protection of civilians. We also work with the military to adapt POC practices and measures to the context of intensive warfighting. And we are open to share that knowledge that and experience that we have in Ukraine with other countries, and we hope to do more work on that in future. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to a lively discussion today.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for opening this event. And thank you very much, Oksana, really for putting all the effort into coming here and sharing your insights and giving all this information and providing really this basis on which we can now continue our discussions. Now, we're already fully into the topic, so I'm not going to waste any of our time and jump really right into the issue. And I think we heard it. The suffering of civilians is considerable. War continues. War continues in Europe, but also, as we all know, not only here, but there's a lot of human suffering and fighting in many conflicts around the world, Yemen, Syria, etc., etc. It's quite a long list. So that leads us basically to two facts. One fact, Ambassador Grimminger has alluded to it, is we had a significant normative progress. So we have international laws that are well established. We have a lot of policies at the institutional level, like NATO, UN, etc., but also among states. That's fact number one. But fact number two is that we continue to see these high levels of civilian suffering. And I think that basically, looking at both together, leads really to the questions, well, isn't this paradoxical? Are we doing things right? What could we do differently? And as I said, I think we should jump into that and discuss this right away. And so with that, if I may, Stuart, start here. If we're looking at the normative framework today, and we've really come a long way. Well, in your opinion, what is good, what is bad, what works, what not? The protection of civilians involves the concept of protection. It involves the term civilians. What are they in a nutshell, and are they actually sufficient to guide proper action? And in general, is the current normative framework sufficient and ready to do its job to protect civilians?
Thanks very much, and thank you to all of you for coming, to GCSP for organizing this, to Tobias for putting up with me as co-author. It can't have been easy. As a lawyer, we love talking about definitions. We love talking about concepts, but this is one area where I really do think we need some more clarity and some more work. It isn't just semantics that we're coming up against. And as Tobias mentioned, we have our two core concepts. Let's start with civilian. Now, in an international armed conflict, an interstate armed conflict, it's relatively straightforward, at least in legal theory. Anyone who isn't a member of one of the armed forces that's parties to the conflict, associated militia, or a spontaneous uprising, what we call a levée en masse. That's a fairly clear, neat distinction. If we move into non-international armed conflict, which still, at least in terms of numbers, remains the most preponderant form of armed conflict, this is where things start to get difficult. We have the ICRC's interpretive guidance on direct participation in hostilities. And with all due deference to the ICRC, which does an outstanding job in the field operationally, has some of the world's best lawyers, I think there are some concerns. The first of this is this notion of continuous combat function. What that means is an individual who would normally be a civilian is deemed to be an ongoing member, military member of an armed group, and is therefore no longer a civilian. Now, that concept doesn't exist anywhere in IHL treaties. It was developed during the discussions that the organization held, but I think it's problematic. And it's especially problematic if we come to the second aspect, which is that notion of direct participation in hostilities. When an individual who is ostensibly a civilian and therefore protected against attack under IHL loses that immunity from attack, loses that protection. Now, let me be very clear. There are some excellent things in the interpretive guidance. It's not for a moment a question of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying we need to set it aside. But the definition of direct participation, in particular, the notion of threshold of harm in the ICRC's guidance is extremely broad. It's much broader than it was in their commentaries on the 1977 additional protocols. And I would have preferred that they would have stayed closer to that. Is that just semantics? No, because what happens is, on the one hand, you are laying the door open to an individual being targeted. And as we know, the standard for identifying whether an individual is participating or not is extremely low. It's feasible, not possible, much less necessary verification. So the standard of verification is low, and then the understanding of participation is extremely broad. And some of you will have read just a couple of years ago the International Criminal Court's judgment in the Ntaganda case. And there they looked at a particular village. It's come up a number of times in ICC jurisprudence. And there's an attack on a village in Eastern Congo by a non-state armed group. Some of the women who are possibly related to fighters in the village are banging their pots and singing, presumably with a view to distracting the attackers. That, based on the guidance, based on the understanding, was enough to make them legitimate targets under IHL. That is a fundamental protection concern that I do think needs to be addressed. The second issue, of course, is protection. And here we don't have, as such, an international legal definition. We do have the Interagency Standing Committee definition. And here I think we have a operational challenge. The definition as it stands says that protection is all activities aimed at obtaining full respect for the rights of the individual. Now, of course, we all want full respect for the rights of the individual, but how useful operationally is that, I think, is highly questionable. And when the IASC itself commissioned a review, that was the view from the field. This is too broad, this is too unfocused. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is a perfect definition out there, but I do think if we're setting priorities, whether it be in Ukraine or Yemen or Syria We have to be focused because we know how hard it is to achieve even a basic level of protection. You can't be unfocused. You have to be looking for priorities and areas where we can make some progress. So with those thoughts, I'll pass back to you, Tobias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. So Irene, switching from that and taking a focus to NATO. NATO has been spearheading the international efforts on the protection of civilians. If you look in 2011, NATO has intervened in Libya to protect civilians. During its operations in Afghanistan, it has taken numerous measures and protection measures, and really set new standards. In 2016, NATO adopted a policy on the protection of civilians. What we know right now is that NATO obviously is focusing on its eastern border, but what that also implies is that there is a shift in terms of operations. So coming away from protecting civilians and counterinsurgencies and stabilization operations to protecting civilians in hybrid warfare and or high intensity conventional warfare. So if we're looking at this paradigm shift on how you conduct military operations, what does that imply for how you protect civilians? And also how is NATO looking at that and preparing for current or eventually future wars?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation and for providing me with the opportunity to talk about this other topic that is under my portfolio. My title is the Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, but I cover all the entire umbrella of the human security work that the Alliance is doing. And this is particularly important right now because we heard from our Ukrainian representative how the situation is, and then the war in Ukraine really is reminding us, and especially for the Alliance, how all the human security dimension and the civilian dimension are important for us. And this is why, since I joined the Alliances in January, one of my objectives was really to leverage the work that we were doing and make sure that this was included in the strategic concept that you might know has been adopted at the end of June at the Madrid summit. I want to mention this document because this is extremely important to understand the context on where we operate. The strategic concept gives the vision of the work of the Alliance for the coming 10 years. The previous one was adopted in 2010, and there was no mentioning of human peace and security nor human security. So this is a big shift. And this encompasses all the work that is done on the protection of civilian side, children in armed conflict, trafficking, combating trafficking of human beings, and cultural property protection. It's important to understand the context where we are operating. As you correctly pointed out, the policy of protection of civilians at NATO was adopted in 2016, where NATO was in a major operation. This was the context where we were, and meaning how do our troops have to deal to limit, the impact on not harm civilians and how to operate. The question now is that we are no longer in the same situation. The war in Ukraine is different. Ukraine is not an ally, is a partner, is a close partner, but the mandate of the alliance, it is different. As you said, we are protecting our borders, but we don't have a mandate to intervene to protect civilians in the country because we are not present, as we say, boots on the ground. This makes a lot of difference on the way in which we can deal with this. That said, the policy helps us to understand how we can get prepared. So basically, this is why the alliance exists, is to get prepared to defend the borders and the territories. So the shift has been in our approach to this, and including the human dimension and the protection of civilians, and then the connection with the women, peace and security agenda as well. So the gender perspective on the civilian population, in case we would need to be, again, boots on the ground. So very often this is a challenging approach for me to explain, because externally it is perceived that since we have a policy, the policy implies that we have a mandate so that we can go and protect the population. This is not the case. So we are getting ready to be more efficient in the operation. So how do we do this? This is certainly done in terms of training and capacity building. And it's important that in any operation planning and preparation, this dimension is already included since the beginnings. It could seem something very obvious, but this is not the case. It was not the case a few years ago, and this was not the case also when we look at the gender perspective. Very often still, population is analyzed as a block. So people, civilians. So we have the difference, as you mentioned, between civilians or war actors. But if we want to respond properly and to look at the needs of the population, we need to analyze this with different perspectives. And this is where the difference comes, starting from civilians or military, but then go into deeper and all the other categories that are part of this conversation. So raising awareness of certain topics and developing the right measures is in the way in which we are getting ready for a possible and hopefully not needed intervention on the ground.
Thank you very much. And if we shift our focus from NATO to the UN, Ralph, you were the team leader on the protection of civilians at the UN headquarters. What we've seen in UN peace operations, protection of civilians has become really core, not only part of the mission, but really an aim, a purpose, sometimes even of peacekeeping missions. And the UN has really advanced a lot on that, adopted or renewed their policy on POC in 2019. Also published a handbook on protection of civilians in UN peace operations. But we still see that effectively protecting civilians is a huge, huge challenge to many peacekeeping operations, and also sometimes even a political issue at the UN in general. So what, in your sense, what are the most salient challenges for POC in UN peace operations? What do you see? What are promising approaches? What are solutions, or what are also needs that have not been addressed so far that could be addressed? And raising from the practical aspect to the political element of the story, how do you see it in New York in general? How do you see that, for instance, the UN Security Council could improve work or its work on protection of civilians?
Thank you so much. Let me first say that I'm no longer with the UN. I don't speak on their behalf. Neither do I speak on behalf of the US Department of Defense today. These are all, especially a question like this, these are all my personal views. An easy question, of course, the challenges and solutions to the protection of civilians. The challenges, I would hope, are relatively clear to all of us by now. And you know, I really want to thank Ms. Kikot for a really sobering introduction to some of the realities that are being faced right now on the ground in Ukraine. And do you mind if we just do a round of applause? Just to come so far and to deliver a message like that brings, you know, some of the reality home. I think just deserve that. Apologies for interrupting. So, you know, I hope the challenges, you know, really are becoming clear to us. Now, we can look back in time, maybe 30 years ago, with the end of the Cold War, when the UN and UN peacekeeping saw many more successes, some failures as well, but that was, you know, we can point to a number of missions from El Salvador to Mozambique to Namibia, some real positive examples of UN peacekeeping during that time. But that was also a time when the UN had the geopolitical winds at its back. With the end of the Cold War, we saw the US and the Soviet Union withdrawing support from allies and partners and proxies. And so there were a lot of conflicts out there in which the parties were really ready to put down their arms. And not to say that it was easy for the UN at that point. It's never easy in this line of work. But you know, having that wind at your back was really important. We see that dynamic, well, that dynamic, I think, changed some time ago, and we see even more concerning dynamics developing at the moment. We see a great deal of uncertainty. Uncertainty makes different countries, different member states hold more tightly to their national interests, become more defensive around them, and that can withdraw support from initiatives to protect civilians. I think we absolutely see that right now. We see it in the Security Council. The difficulty in reaching consensus, the paralysis around certain issues, particularly where permanent members are involved. Those dynamics, of course, are not really new. The council has never been good at acting where its permanent members' interests are salient. There's been discussion of Security Council reform. I think it would be great to see that process move forward. But in the meantime, we deal with the here and now and within the realm of the possible. So to move to some of, some promising approaches. It's very easy to get despondent, to see conflicts rage and countries, disregard the law, disregard norms. And to think about the changing geopolitical dynamics and expect that, we are entering sort of another period of multilateral hibernation. I honestly do not expect that to happen. I think that while there will be similarities between the Cold War and a potential future, there is also going to be significant differences. We have an architecture built entrenched in civil society in countries around the world, around the protection of civilians, around human rights that we didn't have 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. We also have technology that allows us to see in real time human suffering. Whether it's what's going on in Ukraine or protests in Iran, these things are evident to all of us around the world, whether we're in Geneva or Mumbai or Singapore. And so, I think that we are not going to have a repeat of that period when it was very difficult to get consensus on any issue. The challenge will be finding the right issues. And recently we saw some movement on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was very much a political endeavor. This was an initiative from the UN and HD Center here in Geneva that, was enabled increased exports of grain that has brought global food prices down, in a really significant way for countries in the global south for whom Ukrainian wheat is vital. So this was one of these small victories accomplished predominantly behind closed doors that we didn't hear about. There was no big announcement as negotiations were going on. There were no high-level talks being, there were no summits, and there were certainly no boots being deployed on the ground. But it's that kind of quieter diplomacy that I think, we can think about as something to aim for. Protection of civilians often faces this challenge of expectations. We expect peacekeepers to be able to fly in and save the day. We expect, a human rights report to make sure that someone is held accountable. These are often unrealistic expectations, and they will become more unrealistic in a likely future. So I think that hope is certainly not lost. There are going to be victories to be had, and they may not come through peacekeepers, but the UN will certainly play a role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And Christian, switching then to another organization and organization with a humanitarian purpose, the ICRC. The ICRC's core mission, the very core mission, is to protect civilians. So that's what it's really about. And the ICRC is actually active in practically every conflict around the globe. So what are the most significant challenges to protect and support civilians in conflicts, in modern conflicts, and how does the ICRC go about them?
Thank you very much first for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity. I think it's always important to have that kind of debate and exchange views. Well, indeed, I think you mentioned we know the environment and we know how complicated has become that environment. I think that if I may stress on three main issues, which clearly has in a way totally changed and substantially changed the nature of conflict, and that we continue to see these days. We had very good example at the introduction of this exchange. I think the first thing is the protracted nature of crisis. I mean, as we can see, as we know, conflicts today affects several generations in a row. I guess that in this room, we probably don't remember exactly when the conflict in DRC started, when the conflict in Colombia started, Iraq, and I can continue like this because this war continues again and again. And that raises very important questions, obviously, for humanitarian organization and actors, protection actors like the ICRC. It really poses a serious question on the way we should operate in this more long-term setting. How do we interact with development actors are really key issues and key questions that we are asking ourselves. The second, I would say, changing factor, it's the multiplication of actors that you can see in conflict setting. I mean, I used to work mainly in the Middle East and Africa, and I'll give you the example of Yemen. In the city of Taiz, in the southwest of Yemen, when debriefing colleagues who are working there on a daily basis and while we speak, they're telling us that, you know, from time to time, they have to interact with none less than 30 non-state armed groups. Can you imagine what that means in terms of, you know, explaining the mandate you have, gaining a certain trust and credibility, and then being able at the end of the day to access certain areas, and more importantly, to access people who should be protected in armed conflict. That's a huge challenge. I gave the example of Yemen, but obviously the list is long in terms of, you know, the number of actors you have. By the way, the number or the multiplication of actors is valid for inside a context, but it's also valid outside a context. As you know, there are many more countries indirectly involved in conflict. Many countries we have to interact with, making sure that, you know, the support that is given to certain parties into a conflict is actually a professional support, a responsible support, that when you transfer arms to a certain parties in a conflict, that there are monitoring mechanisms, making sure that they're also, I would say, the basics of international humanitarian law is being taken into consideration and respected. And I can tell you that this is a growing challenge. The third one, which has been mentioned also in the introduction, and this is well known, I mean, just need, unfortunately, to switch on the TV to realize that these wars are mostly taking place in urban settings. And that increased the risk for civilians, of course, living in cities. That increased certainly the risk of more IHL violation very clearly. And we can see it in most of the places where we work now. As you know, in a city also, there's the problem of interconnectivity between different networks. You hit one place and suddenly you have an impact on the access to water, or access to electricity, access to internet, and I can continue like this. So this is the worst case scenario if you are an IHL practitioner, obviously. So that's clearly a key issue. And I'll mention a last one, which is about the war that is taking place in the digital sphere. And the fact that today you have communities, entire communities, being stigmatized because of some messages that are being conveyed on social media. So what do we do very quickly about that? I think the first thing is you mentioned about, you refer to boots on the ground. It's a basic recipe, but that will last. We are active on the ground, proximity to the affected population, making sure that you understand the issues and the challenges that these communities are facing is the number one. Working with local actor, making sure that you involve also local actor and that you are not only, discussing that with organizations who just work in remote, maintaining contact with all actors, not only the state, not only the official army, but non-state armed groups, whoever they are, and states, whoever they are. And this is being, as you know, very much challenged nowadays that suddenly ICRC is talking to everybody. But a few months ago, a few years ago, that was very much welcome and actually promoted. And probably the last one on what we do to face that challenging environment, it's confidentiality in that specific issue. Not saying that that's the only way, it's definitely complementary to other approaches, but from an ICRC perspective and experience, the fact that we keep the dialogue on protection and international humanitarian law issues with non-state armed groups or with state allow us to bring certain trust, hopefully, and then at the end of the day, a better access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So continuing to zoom in on these specificities on the protection of civilians, Irene, you're leading NATO's work on women, peace and security. Looking at those challenges, how are they related to women in conflict? What are approaches that are working or not? How do these challenges fit into the broader agenda on women, peace and security? And then as a last point, switching the category, if we work with categories or however you want to call them, how does NATO deal with other groups that are specifically vulnerable, such as children, elderly, and notably persons with disabilities?
As you know, one of the pillars of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or Resolution 1325, is about protection. I mean, it's focused on protection of conflict-related sexual violence, but we can also broaden the concept of protection. So it is part of this agenda. I mean, it's part of the resolution, protecting women and civilians in this case. How do they fit? I want to go back to the strategic concept because this is really where we are. For me, what it is was important to have this mentioned there, not only as a reflection of what we do as an alliance, but really mentioned as part of the core values of who we are. So going back to this really means that this is what we want to see is really to protect the entire population with a focus on women as well, and then to look at this in throughout the lens of diversity, as you mentioned. What we are trying to do is to see how the two agendas, the two tracks are supporting each other. Came very clearly when we had to deal with the war. What I realized immediately starting attending the briefing in-house that there was not a gender analysis of the conflict. So the conflict is assessed every week based on open sources, on intelligence sources, but there is no reflection of responding to the answer. What is the gender perspective? What is the gender analysis? As I said, the conflict in the population is not a block, is not on a homogeneous category. So what we are trying to do is to work with intelligence, our colleagues in-house, but also in the capitals, to make this shift, try to raise the right question to have the correct answers. It is not easy when we look at the conflict-related sexual violence, which is maybe the area where the two agendas really can, the two tracks can connect. What are the questions? So how many women? How do we measure the protection initiative? How many survivors? How many victims in the sense that they are dead, also killed after being raped? It is not easy to collect this information. So I cannot say that now we have the answers, but at least we are trying to be on track with the right questions. So this means that it will be, my hope is that this will lead to an internal reflection to have this gender analysis of a conflict, because you cannot develop the right measures and responses if you don't analyze the context in the right way. Sex disaggregated data are essential to understand. It's not only by sex, but then as you mentioned by the other categories, to understand the different needs. And I bring two examples very often. When I briefed the first time the NAC about this topic, and it was in March, people were surprised by the fact that I mentioned that when women deliver under extraordinary circumstances, such as a conflict, so delivering underground, the possibility that we can breastfeed is very limited, because the trauma that our body and our mental health will have is that normally we don't our body does not produce milk, even if it's a natural process. So when we were responding in the international community with the humanitarian aid to the women, did any of the people who were planning this response think that milk powder was needed in these circumstances? Because this is what the gender analysis and the needs assessment is about, understanding the different person in the different situation. So, and the civilians, they can have very different needs from the military or the others. The other one is when we look at the diversity, the imposition of the martial law as a category, broader category to men from 18 to 65 did include an analysis of the vulnerable categories. It can be transgender and disabled people. So it's very important that in each and every context, the analysis is put as part of the political choices of the measures that are taken. When it comes to conflict-related sexual violence, this is, of course, the area, as I said, that it's cross-cutting. For us. It's important to raise awareness, to train our staff and our armed forces, and also in case this will happen at the border. When I visited in Lithuania earlier this year, this was our battalion that are reinforcing, are protecting the borders. This was one of the topics that we discussed, to see how they are trained before. If they are, I have to say that there is still some work to do in this area. NATO doesn't have an armed forces. We rely on national armed forces, and the pre-deployment training is part of the responsibility of each of the allies. So we have to see that we are not aligned on the standards, but we are working to improve this. And something I would like to refer to go on the hybrid situation and disinformation, something that we are doing is to train women, civilian women, how to handle misinformation in this conflict. And I think that's a very important way on which we can protect civilians from what is happening in a hybrid war, such as the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Ralph, you're now working for the United States Department of Defense, and the US has recently adopted an action plan for better mitigation risks to civilians. Can you explain or tell us what was the rationale of the action plan? What are the measures? But also, what is the critique towards the action plan? And then also, based on your experience working with international organizations and states, are there any tips and tricks?
Sure, thanks so much. So this civilian harm mitigation and response action plan was initiated about a year ago, probably around January of this year. And it arose in part out of a series of New York Times articles detailing US strikes in Syria, as well as one in Kabul, Afghanistan. But that was the catalyst for this action plan, but it built on work that the US government was doing already. When I began my current position in 2020, there was already a draft instruction that was being consulted, that was, we were working on civilian harm mitigation on this issue. And what those news reports prompted politically was to take this to a higher level and to get the full weight of the government behind it. And that, I think, has been really important. When I first heard that there was an action plan coming out, I'll be very candid, I was not particularly enthusiastic. I worked for the UN for over a decade. I have seen many action plans, some of them on protection of civilians, some of them on other issues, lots of good intentions. Oftentimes, they remained on paper. What has really impressed me throughout this process is the scope and depth of thinking and the willingness to really grapple with some of the core issues. protecting civilians when you are the largest military in the world is an extremely important responsibility, but also a very difficult one. There are many parts of, the military process, from intelligence to targeting to planning, that are classified processes. There are things that external organizations like Civic, which I should say was really, instrumental in building up the popular will in Washington for many years. But they're issues that, when they are classified in that way, it's really difficult for an external actor to comment or to proffer, useful technical fixes. And so what this action plan has done is at the very highest levels, and from really, looking at the full spectrum of what the military does, from training and exercises, the formation of new officers, to doctrinal issues of how targeting decisions get made, how you incorporate the civilian environment into planning and intelligence. That's the scope of this. And so, I think I am very impressed by the degree of commitment that this has shown. Again, I'm inside the House, but I've spent a long time outside of it. And so I say this as someone who's watched protection of civilians issues from outside the US government for many years. I am very impressed by the scope of ambition that this action plan shows. We are now getting to the point of implementation, of actually drawing up procedures, of allocating resources. And so there remains a significant amount of work to be done. And so that, I would say, is one of the most significant lessons. And it was one that, we wrestled with in the United Nations. But the reality was that we had very little control over what our troops were trained in, how many resources they had, or where those resources were allocated. And so, being part of a national military, or within the ambit of a national military, is a significant change. And I think the U.S. government seems to be, taking full advantage of that, of the potential scope of authority there. With regard to critiques, there are, this was an action plan that was drawn up specifically looking towards the future. The reality is that most US military practice for the last 20 years has taken place in contexts of counterinsurgency, mostly land and air warfare in the Middle East, potentially different from future conflicts that the US could face. And there are some who've said that this plan is not looking to that future. Having been, having followed the process closely, having supported the process at a number of critical points, I would really say that this plan is very much looking towards, the kind of future that, we don't like to think about, we don't like to confront. The potential for large-scale combat operations, the potential for war that we haven't seen in a very long time. But that is absolutely the kind of conflict that this plan was developed in preparation for. And so I think that while we do draw on the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan and the lessons of counterinsurgency, they are absolutely being adapted at this moment to potential future conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, if you think back a couple of months, looking at newspapers, you certainly saw the former president of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, standing next to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and he was not just standing there, he was smiling. And that picture really made its way across the globe, really didn't get unnoticed, and was oftentimes heavily criticized. Similarly, you might have seen that the Amnesty International report on human rights violations and IHL violations in Ukraine has been massively criticized. This time, not from the Russian side, that may be expected, but also a lot by supporters of Ukraine. And I think what this shows is how the protection and efforts to protect civilians can really be politicized and maybe even get out of the image that you want to portray or that you want to keep solid, gets taken from you and pulled out of your hands. So disinformation campaigns, fake news, etc., that's not new, but I think in the era of social media, there are new dimensions. So how, as an ICRC, how is this challenge addressed, number one? And number two, is there even a bigger problem to this, because humanitarian organizations may actually be deterred or prevented from actively engaging?
Thank you for that question. I think, as you just said, this is not totally new. It has probably taken different formats in recent months, recent years, but as any other actor working in armed conflict situation, we are in a way very much used to very polarized and very emotional environments. And I think that nobody can actually challenge or not understanding the feeling that you have if you are population affected at a certain time in a certain context. Very complicated to actually fully understand and accept the neutrality, independence of an organization. I think we should be very first clear with that. There are many discontment or criticism that were brought to us that, yes, you can understand on certain behaviors. You mentioned a smile, you mentioned, we can understand that. I think what's more problematic is that it's getting worse. The neutrality, again, independence, impartiality of the humanitarian action, which include the ICRC, obviously, but not only, is being more and more challenged in today's world. That's a fact. You don't need to talk to the previous generation. I mean, it's clearly becoming more and more complicated, more and more politicized, and we have to navigate this environment. I believe that what we are doing now, and the contact and the interaction and the dialogue that can be taking place outside of conflict setting, again, with actors who have an influence on the parties to a conflict, this is where that, core issues of neutrality, impartiality, independence should be defended, preserved, promoted. You also, as many of you, future diplomats, future humanitarian actors, I think that's absolutely key. Because the moment you lose that, again, you can accept and understand that there can be very emotional wave. But if that is preserved for the long term, this is becoming extremely critical. We have lots of debate about, how IHL is relevant in today's conflict. That's obviously a very worrying issue. But you also have now how the very precious space that humanitarians should have is also being contested. So the digital sphere and what you can hear in social media just increase, the problems you may face with that. Indeed, in recent months and until today, we face clear situation in Ukraine, which didn't only have an impact in our operations in Ukraine, but far beyond. And that's where it's becoming very dangerous. From one day to another, our colleagues are being put into danger on the same road I was talking about in Taiz, or in Syria, northeast of Syria, and many other places. I can continue like that. And I think that's extremely important, again, that states we are talking to are very well aware of that. And before, kind of feeding, certain campaign, because that has been the case a bit, unfortunately, understand what's the impact of that. Short term of what we can do in Ukraine, humanitarian actors' security, because that suddenly put into question their security, not only ICRC staff, but the whole Ukrainian Red Cross staff and many other actors. I just want to mention and to end on that note that we tend probably to see the negative issues related to digital sphere, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. I think there also there are positive issues there. That, I mean, you mentioned the fact that today parties to a conflict, whatever they do is being very much visible and probably promoted or published a few hours afterwards. I think that's positive when it comes to respect of international humanitarian law, definitely. I just wanted to mention also a very concrete example where, as a protection actor, thanks to access to open source information, in addition to delegates documenting and meeting communities in cities or in places affected, we are much more able to document rapidly, and at the end of the day, being much more credible in front of authorities, because we bring them facts that we could not only found in talking to communities in Kharkiv, but also, you know, kind of supported by open source information. And I think that the opportunities that protection actors also have with the digital space is really to be taken into consideration and may bring some little light also at the tunnel in terms of improving the way we do protection in such a complex environment.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. And so, Stuart, maybe the last question before we open up to question and answers to really make this a debate. From your perspective as researcher, a brilliant researcher and advisor to numerous operations and projects to protect civilians, what do you think? What are the most important steps forward for states, for international organizations in this field?
Thank you. So I think I would name three, and then I'll also end with a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, because obviously the overwhelming sense is one of helplessness, but I think there are glimmers and there are successes that we can recall. First issue is doctrine. Christian rightly mentioned the issue of urban conflict, and we thought in the mid-90s that the siege of Sarajevo was a throwback, that it was something out of the ordinary that we wouldn't see again. Well, Syria and Ukraine has clearly put paid to that. And I remember reading a few years ago some thoughtful pieces by US military strategists saying, we need to be thinking about doctrine in urban warfare, because we don't want to see civilians dying, but they will die because we don't have the operational approaches that are needed. And then we saw what happened in Mosul, and they proved that they didn't have the operational procedures that were needed. The loss of life, the harm in Mosul by Iraq and the US was very high indeed. So we couldn't sit back and just point at the Syrians and say, that's how not to do it. Watch us, watch how we do it. The second issue is on strategy, is on policy. We document in the book the policies of states around the world on protection of civilians. Now, of course, lots of states have statements, regular statements on the issue, but we only really found two that have a clear, dedicated policy on the protection of civilians. Switzerland is one. It's now a little bit out of date, could do with updating. The UK is the other. They updated it in 2020, but not very well. So those are the positive ones. That just leaves 195 states to go. And I think every state that stands up before the Security Council and says we need to improve the protection of civilians should at least get their own house in order. The third issue is on strategy. In the book, we question why there is no UN strategy. Now, I hear your pain, Ralph, having worked in the organization, you get a sense of, oh, here we go again, another strategy. But I do think there's a need in the United Nations for joined up thinking. The UN's very fond of talking about the need for coordination. Well, you know, that starts at home. And let me give you one example. It's only an anecdote, but as we know, the plural of anecdote is data. And it comes from 10 years ago. I was meeting with a UN organization I won't name them, but to give you a hint, they focus on children. And I sat down with their head of protection and in Congo. So this is in the DRC. And I said, yes, you're trying to do some work around getting children out of armed groups. That's great. That's essential. That's progress. But what about tackling the FARDC, the Congolese armed forces, on the abuses that they're committing? Because most people I met told me that they were actually the bigger abusers of the time. And the head of protection looked at me aghast, and she said, we're the UN, we're here to help the government, not criticize them. Now, if that is the policy position of the head of protection of a UN organization in Congo, you can see why things don't get any better. Final issue, and I promised I'd end on something positive. We have seen normative developments that have made a difference. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the campaign to ban landmines, the ICRC, Canada, other states, made a difference. There are tens of thousands of people who are alive today because of the convention. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is a step forward. There are people alive today as a result. And most recently, the work of Ireland, states, other states, Article 36 and the ICRC on addressing explosive weapons in populated areas. These are small bits of progress, but they do make a difference.